The drive up into the North Cascades takes something out of you, long before the snow even starts to fall. You leave Seattle in the rear view, trading the dense gray sprawl of the I-5 corridor for Highway 20, and slowly the world begins to narrow. The cell service drops out past Marble Mount. The radio stations dissolve into white noise. The towering Douglas firs press in close against the asphalt, turning the daylight into a perpetual bruised twilight. By the time you reach the access road for the Blackridge Dam, you feel less like you've traveled to a new location and more like you've been swallowed by the landscape. I took the Winter Caretaker job in late October. The Bureau of Reclamation had a listing buried on a federal employment board, looking for an experienced technician to babysit a colossal mid-century hydroelectric dam over the 6-month winter closure. The pay was exceptionally good, mostly because nobody in their right mind wanted to do it. From November to April, the access road becomes entirely impassable due to avalanche risks and sheer snow volume. You are flown in via helicopter with enough non-perishable food, diesel fuel, and coffee to last the season. Once the chopper leaves, you are the only human being within a 70-mile radius. It is just you, a few million tons of pouring concrete, and a reservoir of freezing black water holding its breath behind a wall. I wasn't running from the law, and I wasn't running from a bad breakup. I was just tired. 10 years as a systems analyst in a windowless server farm in Bellevue had left me hollowed out. Vibrating with a constant, low-level anxiety had made my teeth ache. I wanted quiet. I wanted the kind of silence that is so absolute it feels heavy. Blackridge Dam offered that. I told the Bureau psychologists I was comfortable with extreme isolation, passed their basic psych evaluation, and packed my bags. The facility itself is a monument to 1960s brutalist engineering. It sits wedged perfectly in a narrow gorge, an elegant, terrifyingly massive arch of pale gray concrete holding back the Blackridge Reservoir. The caretaker's quarters are built directly into the top of the dam, adjacent to the primary control room. It's a utilitarian space. Cinder block walls painted a sickly institutional green, a narrow cot, a kitchenette with an electric stove, and reinforced triple-paned windows that look out over the dizzying 400-foot drop into the spillway below. My routine was established on the first day and solidified into muscle memory by the end of the second week. Wake up at 5 a.m., drink a mug of instant Folgers that tastes like copper and burnt dirt, check the perimeter cameras, walk the upper catwalk to clear ice from the primary weather sensors. Go down into the belly of the dam, a terrifying, claustrophobic network of dripping concrete tunnels known as the galleries, to check the structural integrity gauges and ensure the interior heaters are preventing the concrete from cracking in the sub-zero temperatures. At 6 p.m., you can hear the low subsonic thrum of the standby turbines keeping the facility's power grid alive. You can hear the wind screaming through the gorge, ripping across the concrete like a physical weight. But the loudest sound, the one that took the longest to get used to, is the ice. By mid-December, the reservoir had frozen solid. Millions of cubic feet of water turned into a sprawling sheet of white, stretching miles back into the valley. As the temperature drops at night, the ice expands and contracts. It groans, it snaps, it produces deep, resonating booms that echo through the concrete walls of my quarters like artillery fire. Sometimes it sounds incredibly human. A long, drawn-out screech of shifting ice against the dam's face can sound exactly like a woman wailing in the dark. I learned to ignore it. I learned to put on my heavy Carhartt jacket, brew another cup of terrible coffee, and read paperback thrillers under the hum of the fluorescent lights. I was completely unbothered. I was a professional, executing a simple job in an isolated place. That illusion of control shattered on night 42. It was a Tuesday in early January. The temperature outside had plummeted to 19 below zero, bringing with it a fierce, blinding blizzard that completely obscured the cameras. The monitors in the control room showed nothing but swirling gray static as the snow blinded the lenses. I had done my evening rounds, checked the galleries, noted a slight drop in the oil pressure on backup generator 2, and returned to the control room. At exactly 6 p.m., I sat down at the heavy metal desk, pulled the teletype keyboard toward me, and typed out the daily log. I woke up all at once, my eyes snapping open in the pitch black of my quarters, my heart hammering against my ribs. The air in the room felt different. It felt dense, metallic, and freezing cold, as if someone had left a massive freezer door open. But that wasn't what woke me. Through the thin cinder block wall separating my room from the main control center, I heard the sound. Clack, 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 whir. It was the teletype machine. It was printing. I lay frozen in my cot, the wool blankets pulled up to my chin, my breath pluming in the freezing air of the room. The Bureau never transmitted data in the middle of the night. There was nobody at the Spokane regional office at 2 a.m. If there was a true emergency, an evacuation protocol, or an incoming seismic event, an incredibly loud siren would trigger. But there was no siren. There was only the harsh, mechanical grinding of the printhead slamming ink onto paper in the empty room next door. Clack, 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 clack. It stopped. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before, suffocating. I threw off the blankets, the biting cold of the room immediately sinking into my thermal underwear. I grabbed the heavy maglite flashlight I kept by my bed and stepped into my boots without lacing them. I walked down the short concrete hallway, the rubber soles of my boots completely soundless. I paused at the heavy steel door of the control room. My hand hesitated over the handle. I am a rational man. I know how analog systems work. Power surges happen. Random line noise can trigger a printer to spit out a line of gibberish characters. A tree branch miles down the valley could be scraping against an exposed section of the copper line, causing an electrical short. It was a machine doing a... I do not know what is waiting for me in the dark by the turbine housings, but I can hear it breathing. It sounds wet. I am going down there anyway. End of report. My stomach dropped into a bottomless freefall. The maglite trembled in my hand. The paper said I was going to go down there, but I had free will. I could just stand here. I could break the loop. I stood completely still in the blue-lit control room, staring at the digital clock. 02:17 a.m. I wasn't going to go. I absolutely was not going to go. But then, from deep beneath my feet, vibrating up through the hundreds of feet of solid concrete, I felt a heavy, profound shudder. It wasn't the sharp crack of ice shifting. It was a dull, rhythmic thud. A mechanical failure? If one of the primary intake valves deep in the lower gallery had cracked due to the extreme freeze, millions of gallons of pressurized water could burst through the concrete, obliterating the interior tunnels and eventually compromising the entire dam structure. If the dam failed, the resulting tidal wave would wipe out 3 towns in the valley below. As caretaker, I was legally, morally, and contractually obligated to investigate structural anomalies. The thud came again. Heavier this time. It rattled the coffee mug on my desk. I looked back at the teletype paper. But it is not loud enough to cover the sound of the lower access door opening. I stared at the bank of CCTV monitors. Camera 4 covered the lower gallery. It was a pitch-black tunnel hundreds of feet below the waterline, flanked by massive steel turbine housings. The monitor for camera 4 was currently displaying pure static. The camera was dead. It had been working perfectly at 6 p.m. 02:18 a.m. Bait was my own sense of duty. I turned away from the desk. I gripped the maglite so hard my knuckles popped. I walked out of the control room and out onto the main upper catwalk. The air out here was brutal, freezing the moisture in my eyes almost instantly. The wind screamed through the concrete pillars. I walked to the heavy steel door that led down into the interior stairwell, the descent into the galleries. I pulled the heavy latch. The door groaned open with a shrieking grind of metal on metal. The air that drifted up from the stairwell was utterly pitch black, smelling of ancient concrete, rust, and something else, something organic, something that smelled like stagnant water and rotting fish. I flicked on the mag light, casting a brilliant beam of white light down the endless spiral of concrete stairs, plunging into the abyss of the dam. I started to walk down, just like the paper said I would. The descent into the guts of Blackridge Dam is not a journey you take lightly, even on a good day. It is a grueling, vertical plunge down a 400-foot concrete shaft bored directly into the center of the brutalist arch. There are no windows, no natural light, and no sense of the outside world. There is only a narrow, spiraling metal staircase lit by caged, flickering incandescent bulbs placed every 20 feet, casting long, writhing shadows against the curved walls. I gripped the freezing steel of the handrail, my heavy Carhartt boots echoing with sharp, flat cracks against the grating. Clang! 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 The sound was deafening in the confined space, yet it felt entirely swallowed by the sheer, overwhelming mass of the millions of tons of concrete surrounding me. With every rotation down the spiral, the ambient temperature dropped, but the very nature of the cold changed. Up in the control room, the cold was a dry, biting wind blowing off the Cascade peaks. Down here, plunging deep below the waterline of the frozen reservoir, the cold was aggressive and damp. It was a stagnant, subterranean chill that bypassed my heavy winter clothing and settled directly into my bones. I reached the 100-foot mark, the entrance to the upper gallery, and stopped. I stood perfectly still on the metal grating, my breath pluming in thick white clouds, my breathing harsh and loud in the dead air. I aimed the heavy maglite down the long, arching horizontal tunnel. It was completely empty. I looked at my wristwatch. 2:22 a.m. I was doing exactly what the teletype paper had commanded. I was acting out a script written by a machine, or by whatever intelligent anomaly had hijacked it. My analytical mind, trained to find a kinetic impact of that magnitude deep inside the dam, could indicate a catastrophic failure of a penstock tube, the massive pipes that funnel millions of gallons of pressurized lake water into the turbines. If a penstock ruptured, the lower levels would flood in seconds, and the structural integrity of the entire arch would be fatally compromised. If the dam broke, 3 entire towns in the valley below would be wiped off the map before sunrise. Thousands would die in their beds under a tidal wave of freezing black water. The machine knew this. Whatever wrote that log entry knew exactly which psychological and professional levers to pull to guarantee my compliance. It wasn't predicting my future, it was coercing it. I turned back around and began to descend, moving much faster now, my boots slipping slightly on the condensation gathering on the metal grates. Passing the 200-foot mark, the environment shifted. The walls were no longer dry concrete. They were heavily calcified, coated in thick white streaks of minerals leached out of the cement by the constant microscopic seepage of the lake water pressing from the outside. The smell hit me here too. It was the faint scent I had noticed when I first opened the door, magnified tenfold. It smelled of deep, ancient water that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. It smelled of heavy silt, oxidized iron, and rotting aquatic vegetation. It smelled like the bottom of a dead ocean. I kept going. The spiral tightened, the air growing denser, the smell of rot becoming so thick it coated the back of my throat, making my stomach heave. Finally, my boots hit a flat, solid surface. I had reached the floor of the lower gallery, 400 feet below the crest of the dam, dozens of feet below the frozen bedrock of the river gorge outside. The lower gallery is a cavernous, vaulted space. The ceiling is 40 feet high, crisscrossed with heavy steel I-beams. 4 massive cylindrical turbine housings sit in a perfect row down the center of the hall, painted a fading industrial yellow. Beyond the turbines, at the far end of the gallery, is the lower access door, a submarine-style heavy steel bulkhead leading out to the pressure release spillway at the base of the dam. I stood at the base of the stairwell, sweeping the brilliant beam of the maglite across the dark, echoing room. The overhead bulbs down here had long since burned out due to the moisture. Only the emergency red egress lights above the doorways provided any illumination, casting the massive gallery in a hellish crimson gloom. My immediate priority was camera 4. I needed to know why the video feed up in the control room had suddenly cut to static. I walked cautiously toward the first turbine housing, my boots splashing softly in a quarter-inch of freezing seepage water. I shined the light up at the concrete pillar where the camera was mounted. It hadn't just malfunctioned. The heavy, weatherproof steel casing had been violently crushed. The thick, reinforced glass lens was shattered outward, and the metal housing was bent at a grotesque angle, warped as if it had been squeezed in the fist of a hydraulic press. Most disturbingly, the heavy half-inch solid steel bolts securing it to the pillar had been sheared completely flush with the concrete. No human being could do that. A drop of freezing water fell from the vaulted ceiling and hit the back of my neck. I flinched violently, a choked gasp escaping my lips, and whipped the maglite around to scan the dark corners of the gallery. Nothing. Just the massive yellow curves of the turbines and a long crimson shadows. I moved deeper into the room, keeping my back pressed to the cold wall, my eyes locked on the far end of the gallery, the lower access door. The teletype log echoed relentlessly in my head. It is not loud enough to cover the sound of the lower access door opening. I reached the third turbine, my heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm. I angled the beam of the flashlight toward the far wall. The access door was a massive circle of forged steel, secured by an immense rotary locking wheel. It was designed to completely seal the gallery against a flood. The beam of white light hit the door. The massive rotary locking wheel was spun completely counterclockwise. The heavy steel deadbolts were fully retracted. The door itself, weighing at least 3 tons, was standing open a full foot. A wave of primal, paralyzing terror washed over me, rooting my boots to the concrete. That door was mechanically sealed from the inside. There was no keyhole, no electronic keypad on the outside. To open it, something had to stand right here in this gallery and manually turn the heavy iron wheel. But the room was empty. Beyond the cracked door lay the maintenance access tunnel to the spillway. It was pitch black inside the crack, a void. I stood frozen beside the third turbine, the flashlight beam trembling uncontrollably on the heavy steel door. I could not bring myself to step a single inch closer. The rational part of my brain had completely shut down, violently overridden by an ancient instinct screaming at me to run. Then, over the low hum of the electric heaters, I heard the sound. It was a wet, heavy, rhythmic intake of air. It echoed out from the pitch-black tunnel beyond the open access door. It did not sound human. It sounded impossibly large, like lungs the size of industrial oil drums pulling in the freezing, damp air. The exhalation was accompanied by a wet, heavy slapping sound, like hundreds of pounds of raw, wet meat being dragged across slick concrete. Whatever was making the sound was moving in the dark, shifting an immense, impossible bulk in the tunnel just beyond the door. I took a slow, agonizing step backward. My boot splashed softly in the standing water. The sound from the tunnel stopped instantly. Absolute, suffocating silence crashed down on the gallery. It had heard me. My breath hitched and locked in my throat. I couldn't blink. I kept the mag light trained perfectly on the vertical crack of darkness. For a long, agonizing minute, absolutely nothing happened. Then, a shape blocked the darkness in the gap. It was only a partial glimpse, but it burned itself into my retinas. It was a towering, undulating wall of pale, slick, translucent flesh, completely devoid of hair, scales, or recognizable features. It glistened with a thick layer of dark slime. It pressed against the steel door, filling the gap entirely from the floor to the top of the frame. From the center of that shifting mass, a single massive eye rolled wetly into view. It was lidless, milky white like the eye of a dead fish, pupilless and blind. Yet it radiated an ancient, cold, predatory malice. The thing pressed harder against the steel door. The 3-ton bulkhead groaned in protest, the massive steel hinges screaming as the pale mass attempted to force the gap wider. Screech! The heavy steel door scraped an inch toward me. The spell of paralysis broke. Pure adrenaline flooded my bloodstream. I didn't think. I simply reacted. I spun on my heel and bolted. I ran faster than I have ever run in my entire life, my boots tearing through the standing water. I scrambled blindly past the yellow turbines, the beam of the maglite bouncing wildly off the ceiling. I didn't look back. I knew, with the absolute certainty of a prey animal, that if I looked over my shoulder, I would die. I hit the base of the stairwell at a dead sprint, practically launching myself up the metal grates. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my thigh muscles instantly burning. Behind me, from the floor of the gallery, I heard the horrific sound of groaning metal as the door was forced completely open, followed by a colossal wet splash. Then came a frantic, rhythmic slapping that was moving terrifyingly fast across the gallery floor, heading directly for the stairs. Slap, 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 slap. I hauled myself up the spiral. The darkness of the shaft threatened to swallow me whole. The slapping sound below me abruptly changed. It became a frantic, scraping, hauling scramble of heavy, wet bulk ascending the metal stairs. It was climbing. It was coming up after me. God, no, I gasped, reaching the 200-foot mark. I was suffocating on my own exertion, but the sound below was getting louder. It was impossibly fast. I passed the upper gallery. My legs were turning to solid lead. The scraping, wet sound was perhaps 50 feet below me now. I could smell it again, that concentrated stench of rotting ocean billowing up the shaft like a physical wave. I saw the heavy steel door at the top of the stairs, the exit. With a final, desperate surge of frantic energy, I lunged upward, my hand slamming hard against the cold steel of the latch. I pulled the heavy door open, fell out onto the upper catwalk, and the freezing, dry wind of the blizzard hit my face. I scrambled wildly to my feet, grabbed the heavy iron handle of the stairwell door, and slammed it shut with all my remaining strength. I threw the heavy exterior deadbolt, locking the mechanism firmly into place. I backed away, chest heaving violently. I waited for the massive impact of the pale mass slamming against the other side. Nothing happened. The door remained perfectly still. I stumbled backward, moving away from the catwalk and back toward the control room. I pushed through the interior doors, the harsh fluorescent lights blinding me momentarily. I didn't care about the blizzard or the protocols anymore. I was going to use the teletype to send a mayday to Spokane. I was abandoning the dam. I burst into the control room, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. The room was exactly as I had left it. The soft blue glow of the monitors, the half-eaten can of beef stew, and the sound. Clack, 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 whir. My blood turned to ice. The teletype machine in the corner was printing again. I walked over to it, my legs feeling like fragile glass. The spool of paper was feeding rapidly. I stared at the fresh black text emerging from the machine. It wasn't formatted like my logs anymore. Log received. We saw you. You run fast. The door will not hold. We are coming up. End of transmission. I stared at the teletype machine, the fresh black ink mocking every law of physics and telecommunications I had ever known. We are coming up. A machine hardwired to a government office in Spokane was actively communicating with a subterranean nightmare. It wasn't just predicting my actions anymore. It was hunting me. My heart, an older muscle, tired from years of black coffee, bad sleep, and the quiet stress of server farms, fluttered wildly against my ribs. The pain shot down my left arm, a terrifying reminder of my 58 years. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford when you are 70 miles from the nearest human being. Panic in the North Cascades kills you just as effectively as exposure. "Work the problem," I whispered, my voice sounding painfully thin in the humming quiet of the control room. I was a systems analyst. I diagnosed catastrophic failures. I needed to treat this as a localized system breach. The threat was highly aggressive, possessed an impossible mass, and was currently ascending the primary stairwell. I had locked the reinforced steel door at the top of the shaft, but the teletype had explicitly warned me it wouldn't hold. After seeing what it did to half-inch steel bolts in the lower gallery, I believed it. I threw myself into the chair and slammed my hands onto the heavy mechanical keyboard. If the copper line was open, I could still transmit. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. Blackridge Dam caretaker under assault by unknown hostiles. Imminent threat to life. Requesting immediate evacuation." I hit the yellow transmit button. The machine whined, shrieking the data packet over the wire. I waited, the breath rattling in my lungs. 10 seconds. 30. Then the printhead violently jerked to life. "Spokane does not hear you. The wire is ours now. It is cold up here. Let us in." I ripped the paper out with a wordless yell and threw it across the room. The isolation was absolute. No cavalry was coming. I needed weapons. The control room was a reinforced bunker, but it was also a dead end. If they breached the interior door, I would be trapped in a cinder block cage. I rushed to the emergency supply locker, tearing the plastic seal and throwing the doors open. Bypassing the first aid kits, I grabbed a solid steel pipe wrench, 2 feet long and weighing 10 pounds. Next, I grabbed the Orion Marine flare gun. It was bright orange plastic, meant for signaling, but it fired a 12-gauge incendiary phosphorus charge that burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. I shoved it into my heavy Carhartt jacket pocket and slung the plastic bandolier of 4 extra flares over my shoulder. Just as I turned around, the lights died. It was a sudden, violent severing of the main power feed. The fluorescent tubes snapped off, plunging me into suffocating darkness. Simultaneously, the low, subsonic thrum of the standby turbines, the heartbeat of the dam, fell completely silent. They had destroyed the hydroelectric generators in the lower levels. 10 seconds later, the emergency diesel generators kicked in with a metallic clack. The room was bathed in the harsh, hellish crimson glow of the emergency egress lights. The CRT monitors flickered back to life on battery backups, but with the main grid dead, the industrial heaters were off. Within minutes, the temperature inside the facility would plummet to match the 19 below zero blizzard outside. The concrete walls immediately began to radiate a bone-deep cold. I looked at the security monitors. Most were static, but camera 2, angled at the upper catwalk, was still functioning through the swirling snow. I stared at the red-tinted screen. The heavy steel door of the stairwell was bowing outward. The 3-inch thick steel was warping under immense pressure from the inside. Industrial paint flaked off the metal. Then the audio feed crackled to life over the howling blizzard. Screech! Bang! A concussive impact hit the door. The heavy exterior deadbolt, a bar of solid forged iron, visibly bent. Bang! The concrete around the doorframe spiderwebbed with jagged cracks. I couldn't stay here. I needed higher ground. I needed the communication shack on the roof of the high-voltage switchyard, a quarter-mile walk across the crest of the dam. It housed a high-frequency emergency radio that bounced analog signals off the ionosphere, completely independent of the copper line. I pulled my wool beanie down and strapped my polarized speed goggles over my eyes. I gripped the steel pipe wrench. I felt intensely old and fragile, thrust into an apex predator's hunting ground. Bang! On the monitor, the top hinge of the stairwell door sheared off, rocketing into the blizzard like shrapnel. It was now or never. I unlocked. It didn't have a mouth, only a pulsing opening at its base that inhaled the freezing air with that horrific, wet, sound. I stopped breathing, pressing myself flat against the wall, praying the screaming wind would mask my scent. The creature turned toward the control room I had just evacuated. It reared up, tentacles slapping against the reinforced glass of my quarters, leaving thick, dark smears of freezing slime. I didn't wait. I turned and ran as fast as my stiff legs allowed, heading for the long, exposed walkway across the crest of the dam. The crest is a flat 20-foot wide concrete roadway spanning the gorge. On my left was a short parapet and the frozen expanse of Blackridge Lake. On my right, a chain-link fence and a 400-foot drop to the riverbed. I broke into a clumsy, heavy-footed run. The crosswinds out here battered me, trying to sweep my legs out. I kept my left hand trailing along the parapet for balance, pushing blindly through the whiteout. I was halfway across the quarter-mile span when the ice began to sing. It wasn't the normal groaning of winter ice. It was a rapid, violent staccato of sharp, deafening cracks that sounded like heavy artillery fire. I stopped, wiping snow from my goggles, and looked over the parapet at the frozen reservoir. The emergency red lights reflected weakly off the ice, illuminating a nightmare of scale. The ice was being smashed from below. Massive, spider-webbing fractures exploded across the surface. Beneath the semi-translucent ice, swarming through the freezing black water, were hundreds of massive, dark silhouettes. They were slamming their bulk against the underside of the frozen surface. The dam had sealed off a deep-water trench, trapping an ancient ecosystem, and now they were waking up. Right before my eyes, a section of ice the size of a basketball court exploded upward. From the churning black water, a pale tentacle the thickness of a redwood trunk erupted into the air, slamming down onto the concrete face of the dam. They were going to climb the wall. A wet, heavy, rhythmic slapping cut through the wind behind me. I whipped my head around. The entity from the stairwell was moving across the roadway, following my path. Its tentacles pulled its bulk forward in an undulating sprint. The cluster of milky eyes was locked directly on me. I abandoned caution and ran with desperate, pathetic urgency, my lungs burning as if inhaling shattered glass. The comms shack was still 100 yards away, sitting on an elevated steel platform. Slap, slap, slap. It sounded like a butcher throwing sides of beef against wet tile. The stench of rotting silt overtook the ozone, gagging me. I reached the steel stairs of the shack, ignoring the searing pain as the frozen railing stuck to my gloves. I hauled myself up and practically dove at the heavy steel door. I could hear the wet, heavy of its breathing at the base of the stairs. I twisted the handle, fell inside the pitch-black shack, kicked the door shut, and threw the industrial deadbolt. A split second later, a colossal, wet weight slammed against. Then my voice returned, speaking in the calm, deadpan tone I used for my daily logs. The caretaker is in the box. The caretaker has locked the door. The ice is broken. We are very hungry. End of report. A split second later, the frosted glass window of the comms shack exploded inward. A pale, steaming tentacle as thick as a man's torso ripped through the frame, violently thrashing in the cramped space, searching for me in the dark. The tentacle whipped through the confined space of the comms shack with the mindless, devastating force of a derailed train. It swept across the metal desk, instantly obliterating the high-frequency radio and shattering the digital console into a shower of sparks and jagged plastic. The heavy microphone, the one that had just broadcast my own doomed voice back to me, was crushed into unrecognizable shrapnel. I threw myself backward, my heavy Carhartt jacket scraping against the cinder block wall. The pale, muscular appendage thrashed blindly, searching for the heat of my body. Up close, the stench was paralyzing, a concentrated miasma of rotting kelp, stagnant water, and ancient anaerobic decay. The flesh of the creature wasn't smooth. It was heavily textured, with thick, pulsing veins, and coated in a dark, viscous mucus that sizzled violently as it dripped onto the exposed electrical wiring of the ruined desk. The tentacle arched, feeling the air, and then lunged toward the corner where I was pinned. I didn't have room to swing the heavy steel pipe wrench. I dropped it, my frantic, freezing fingers plunging into my deep jacket pocket. My hand closed around the thick, ridged plastic grip of the Orion marine flare gun. As the pale mass lunged, its slick surface brushing against my boots, I raised the bright orange pistol, aimed dead center at the thickest part of the appendage, and pulled the heavy trigger. Thump crack! The recoil snapped my wrist back painfully. In the cramped, dark shack, the muzzle flash was blinding, a brilliant magnesium-white explosion that seared my retinas. A 12-gauge marine flare is not a bullet. It is a chemical incendiary projectile designed to ignite instantly and burn at 3. The single overhead bulb flickered and died as the diesel generator outside sputtered, choked by the freezing wind, and finally gave out. I was kneeling in the pitch black, exposed to a 19 below zero gale. I was going to freeze to death in less than 10 minutes. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking uncontrollably. I cracked the breech of the Orion flare gun, the spent plastic shell ejecting with a hiss, and loaded a fresh flare from the bandolier with numb, clumsy fingers. 3 shots left. I stepped cautiously to the shattered window frame and looked down. Illuminated by the faint red glow of the dam's emergency lights, I saw the entity on the catwalk below. It was writhing in a grotesque, undulating frenzy. The blinding white light of the phosphorus flare was still burning fiercely from within its mass, illuminating its translucent biology like a macabre X-ray. It dragged its immense bulk away from the shack, blindly throwing itself toward the edge of the catwalk, trying to escape the chemical fire eating its nervous system. With a sickening, heavy slide, the burning creature tumbled over the railing, plummeting 400 feet down into the dark, frozen canyon below. The immediate threat was gone, but the larger nightmare was just beginning. Through the swirling snow, I looked across the quarter-mile span of the dam's crest. The nightmare had fully breached the surface. Massive, pale shapes were hauling themselves over the concrete parapet, their thick tentacles gripping the freezing stone. There were dozens of them. They moved with a horrifying fluid grace, their multiple milky eyes scanning the crest. The reservoir had To reach the garage, I had to descend a narrow, zigzagging set of maintenance stairs that led into the high-voltage switchyard, a massive, flat concrete pad at the base of the canyon wall, filled with towering electrical transformers and a maze of steel scaffolding. I held my breath, the white plumes of vapor trapped behind my clenched teeth. 30 feet away, emerging from the curtain of white snow, a silhouette materialized. It was one of them. It was smaller than the one that had attacked the shack, but still easily the size of a pickup truck. It moved differently on the flat ground, less dragging, more of an undulating predatory glide. It was actively hunting. Its pale flesh split open, revealing a row of 6 milky blind eyes that rolled erratically. The massive sphincter at its base pulsed. It was drawing in the air, tasting the wind, searching for the thermal bloom of a warm-blooded mammal. It was between me and the garage doors. My systems analyst brain, the part of me that dealt in logic gates and cause and effect, kicked into a state of hyperclarity. The creature was blind. It hunted by scent, heat, and vibration. The blizzard was masking my scent and my body heat, but if I moved, it would feel the vibration of my boots on the concrete. If I shot it with the flare gun, the light and heat would instantly draw every other entity on the dam to my exact location. I needed a distraction, a kinetic decoy. I looked down at my right hand, tightly gripping the 10-pound solid steel pipe wrench. Slowly, agonizingly, I raised my arm. My joints popped with the cold, but the wind covered the sound. I targeted a towering skeletal steel pylon about 40 yards to my left, standing in the opposite direction of the garage. I braced my boots against the concrete, pivoted my torso, and hurled the heavy steel wrench with every ounce of remaining strength I possessed. The wrench sailed through the blizzard and struck the steel pylon with a massive ringing clang that echoed sharply through the switchyard. The creature reacted instantly. Its massive bulk whipped around with terrifying speed. The tentacles dug into the snow, propelling the pale mass aggressively toward the ringing steel structure, the milky eyes fixated on the source of the vibration. I didn't hesitate. As soon as its back was turned, I broke cover. I sprinted silently, keeping my footfalls as light as possible, sliding across the snowy concrete toward the sheer granite wall of the canyon. The dark rectangular outline of the heavy garage doors materialized out of the whiteout. I reached the small industrial side door. My freezing fingers fumbled wildly with the heavy ring of facility keys clipped to my belt. I found the square brass key, jammed it into the deadbolt, and twisted. The lock clicked. I pulled the door open, slipped inside the pitch-black garage, and gently, silently eased the door shut behind me, engaging the interior deadbolt. I collapsed against the cold steel of the door, sliding down to the concrete floor. It was freezing inside, but the screaming wind was gone. The absolute darkness of the garage was a comforting blanket. I had made it. I had bypassed the swarm. I pulled my flashlight from my belt and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, sweeping over shelves of motor oil, spare tires, and heavy tools. And there, sitting in the center of the bay, was the Bombardier's snowcat. It was a beautiful, utilitarian beast, painted bright orange, sitting high on heavy rubber tracks, equipped with a massive front plow. I pushed myself off the floor and walked quickly to the driver's side door. I pulled the handle. It was unlocked. I climbed into the heavy, insulated cabin and slammed the door shut, locking it from the inside. The cabin was freezing, but it smelled of old diesel, vinyl, and safety. I sank into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I reached for the steering column. The keys were dangling in the ignition. Standard Bureau protocol. "Thank you," I whispered to whatever engineer had left them there. I reached out, gripped the cold metal key, and turned it halfway to prime the engine block heater. A few amber dashboard lights flickered to life. I waited 5 agonizing seconds for the glow plugs to warm, then turned the key the rest of the way. The massive diesel engine coughed, shuddered violently, and roared to life with a deafening, beautiful mechanical rumble. The headlights blazed on, illuminating the heavy corrugated steel of the main garage doors in front of me. The cabin heater immediately began blowing cold air, which would soon turn warm. I had a 2-ton, tracked battering ram. I was going to push the button for the hydraulic garage doors, shift into drive, and carve my way down the mountain. I let out a long, shuddering breath, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in the back of my throat. I had outsmarted them. Then the dashboard lights flickered. The heavy diesel engine didn't stall, but its pitch changed, taking on a low, unnatural whine. In the center of the dashboard, the snowcat's built-in CB radio, a closed-circuit analog system used entirely for vehicle-to-base communication, suddenly clicked on. The green digital display illuminated the dark cabin. The static hissed for a brief second. Then, over the roaring of the diesel engine, a voice filled the small cabin. It was perfectly clear, devoid of any static, and it was speaking in my exact deadpan analytical tone. "The caretaker thinks he is safe. The caretaker thinks the machine will save him." My blood turned to ice. My hand froze over the gear shift. The copper line hadn't been the only thing compromised. The intelligence wasn't just in the wires. It was in the frequency. The CB radio clicked, the static shifting, and my stolen voice spoke again, dropping to a horrific, distorted whisper. "Look in the rearview mirror." The human brain is a remarkable instrument of denial. When confronted with an impossible, sanity-shattering reality, the first instinct is to reject it. For 3 agonizing seconds, my hand hovered over the gear shift of the rumbling snowcat, and I tried to convince myself I was suffering from auditory hallucinations brought on by hypothermia. The CB radio hissed again. My own voice, calm, deadpan and utterly devoid of humanity, whispered from the dashboard speaker, "The caretaker is stalling. Look in the mirror." I didn't want to look. Every survival instinct begged me to throw the machine into drive and smash blindly through the garage doors, but the terrifying gravity of the command pulled at my eyes. Slowly, I raised my gaze to the rearview mirror. The rear passenger compartment was unlit, but in the dim amber reflection of the dashboard, I saw the darkness moving. It had not opened a door. It had seeped inside. The rubber weather stripping around the emergency hatch hung in shredded strips. A mass of pale, translucent flesh had squeezed itself through the gap, pooling onto the vinyl seats and rapidly expanding. It was a parasitic offshoot, drawing mass from somewhere outside. Thick, wet tendrils had whipped around the roll bars. The flesh parted with a sickening schlick, and 3 milky, dead white eyes rolled up, locking onto my reflection. The stench hit me, a concentrated blast of rotting ocean silt that instantly overpowered the diesel exhaust. "We are inside the machine," the radio whispered in my voice. "We are inside everything now." A thick, muscular tentacle lunged forward, shooting between the front seats and wrapping around the steel mesh divider just inches from my ear. The metal groaned under its grip. I didn't scream. I acted with the absolute unthinking violence of a cornered animal. I dropped the keys, reached into my pocket, and ripped out the Orion flare gun. I shoved the bright orange barrel through the gap in the divider, directly into the writhing pale mass, and pulled the trigger. Thump, crack. The explosion inside the confined cab was deafening, a concussive wave that ruptured my left eardrum. A high-pitched ring replaced the roar of the engine. The interior was flooded with blinding magnesium white light. The 3,000-degree phosphorus flare buried itself in the creature's core. The entity thrashed with apocalyptic violence. The pale flesh flash boiled, filling the cabin with a toxic cloud of superheated steam and vaporized slime. The creature's tendrils smashed against the rear windows. The reinforced glass spiderwebbed and blew outward under the thermal shock. The sub-zero blizzard howled in, sucking the toxic smoke out. The burning nos of the creature writhed backward, desperate to escape the chemical fire, and hurled itself out the broken window onto the concrete floor. I was half-blinded and bleeding from my ear, but I was alive. I grabbed the gear shift, slammed the transmission into drive, and stomped the heavy accelerator pedal to the floorboards. The Snowcat's massive turbo diesel engine roared. The 2-ton machine lurched forward like a chained beast cut loose. I hit the heavy corrugated steel garage doors I flipped on the heavy-duty wipers, smearing the fluid across the glass, but I could still see the gap in the fence. "The caretaker cannot run," the CB radio crackled, warped by the magnetic interference of the transformers. "The mountain is ours." I violently smashed my fist into the CB console, shattering the plastic dial and ripping the cord out. The voice died, replaced by the roar of the engine. I hit the access road. It was a 10-mile, steeply graded shelf cut into the gorge, buried under 4 feet of pristine powder. To my right, a solid wall of granite. To my left, a sheer drop into the abyss. The heavy rubber tracks engaged, chewing through the snow. I navigated the treacherous terrain entirely by memory. I checked the side mirrors. They were pursuing me. They moved faster in the deep snow, their muscular tentacles propelling them forward in a terrifying, undulating wave. A pale, writhing avalanche of biological horror swarmed down the road behind me. I pushed the throttle into the red. I was doing 40 down a blind, unplowed mountain pass. One wrong twitch, and I was going over the edge. Suddenly, a massive impact slammed onto the roof of the cabin. The thick steel plating buckled inward with a terrifying screech. The Snowcats swerved dangerously close to the precipice. One of them had climbed the granite wall and dropped directly onto the moving vehicle. Thick, pale tentacles slithered down the windshield, instantly blocking my view. The entire chassis groaned under its immense weight. I was driving blind, approaching the Devil's Elbow, a sharp hairpin turn less than 200 yards ahead. If I didn't navigate it perfectly, we were going over. I had one move left, a gamble of pure suicidal physics. I let go of the steering wheel with my right hand, kept my foot buried on the accelerator, and waited for my internal clock to tell me the curve was upon us. Then I violently yanked the wheel hard to the right. The snowcat fishtailed, slamming laterally into the sheer granite wall. The impact was deafening. Sparks showered the blizzard. The creature on the roof was violently pinned between the roof and the jagged rock. It shrieked, a wet, whistling release of pressure as its flesh was brutally sheared off by the friction. I ground the entity into a dark smear against the rock face before violently correcting the steering wheel back to the left. The tentacles fell away from the windshield. I had scraped it off. I hit the brakes, drifting the heavy machine through the Devil's Elbow, the rear tracks hanging terrifyingly over the abyss before finally catching traction. I accelerated out of the curve, but my relief was instantly shattered. The violent impact, combined with the roar of the diesel engine, had triggered the exact catastrophic event the Bureau had warned me about. High above me, the mountain groaned. 1,000,000 tons of snow, ice, and rock broke loose from the peak. An avalanche. I looked in the side mirror. The pale swarm was rounding the Devil's Elbow. And then, the mountain fell on them. A towering wall of white death cascaded down the sheer slope, hitting the access road with a catastrophic impact. It instantly buried the pursuing swarm under 50 feet of compacted ice and granite boulders. The blast of displaced air hit the rear of the snowcat a second later. I was shoved forward, riding the chaotic edge of the avalanche's outer wake. The machine pitched and slammed back down onto the roadbed as the grade leveled out. The avalanche roared past, plummeting into the deep gorge below, taking the pale nightmares with it. I kept my foot on the gas, driving the battered snowcat through the fading blizzard. Hours passed. The steep canyon walls gave way to rolling foothills. At 7 a.m., the heavy tracks hit the cleared asphalt of Highway 20. I was out of the dead zone. 10 miles later, I pulled into the plowed parking lot of the Bureau's Lowland substation. The physical horrors were locked away in the dark behind millions of tons of concrete. I unlocked the front door of the empty substation and stepped into the brightly lit office. I walked toward the wall-mounted phone, ready to dial 911 and end the nightmare. Then, I stopped. Sitting on a metal desk in the corner was the receiver terminal, a bulky teletype machine hardwired into the exact same buried copper line that ran up the mountain to Blackridge Dam. As I reached for the telephone, the teletype machine violently clattered to life. The printhead jerked across the yellow paper. I walked over to it, my blood turning to ice, and looked down at the freshly printed text. Log received. The physical forms are buried, but the wire is still ours. We are in the grid now. Where are you going, caretaker? End of transmission. The machine fell silent. Outside, the town's power grid, the streetlights, the traffic signals, flickered once, plunged into darkness, and then turned harsh, hellish crimson.